Welcome to Talking Tuesdays. I am your host, Fancy Quant, and today we have a great guest here. Let's welcome Ali Masoumnia. He is going to be the only undergrad to be on this channel, which is pretty impressive. As you know, I am fairly picky on who I do and don't allow as a guest. Just a few highlights on Ali here. He's built a great relationship with me over the last, I don't know, 8 months to a year, maybe 6 months to a year, something around there. He actually reached out for me to present at Queen Universities, so the university that he goes to, their Quant Club, which he is one of the people that runs it. I believe he's like the director, kind of the head of it right now. Anyways, he's asked some great career questions, some great technical questions over the years. He's definitely an all-star quant in the making. So if you're kind of looking at what it looks like to come up as an undergrad with a lot of promise, a great educational background, like everything looks like it's going to be a nice, clean shot for him. Definitely listen to this interview, listen to what he has to say. We're going to cover a few things about him, his background, his perspectives here. We're also going to cover a few kind of tips and pointers on how to work with, network professionals. So kind of how he's worked with me over the years, is also kind of looking at quant clubs in universities and kind of the benefits and pros and cons, kind of what to do, kind of not what to do. So anyways, let's just dive on in and see what he has to say. Welcome to the channel, Ollie.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so to kick this off, as usual here, let's dive into what is your background and kind of how you got to be where you're at today.
Yeah, so I'm actually currently a student, actually from Canada, studying a dual degree. My first degree is in mathematics and engineering. My other degree is in economics at Queen's University. So yeah, I essentially actually took on the leadership role of one of the only extracurriculars in Canada, which focuses on quantitative trading. And yeah.
Okay, so how did you get involved in quantitative finance? So I know a lot of students, right, you're coming from like a math background, and then it's like, how do you transition into like that interest in quant finance?
Yeah, so for me, I think I kind of really sparked my interest in first year. So that would be American terms as a freshman.
Yeah.
Essentially, I think what I realized was that I wanted to do research of some sorts, but I wanted high testability, like quick feedback on if what I was doing was practical and applicable. And what I noticed with academia was they have a good set of rigor with how they conduct their research. Everything's very formal. There's a good culture behind it, especially in mathematics. But that testability kind of lacked for me. I liked how these quant finance firms had great, infrastructure for that testability. Within a day, if you were right or wrong for certain strategies, obviously. But yeah, I think that's really what got my interest. I realized, my degree plan sets me up kind of well for this by accident, and yeah, the more I read into it, the more I was interested.
Okay, and what was the decision making behind getting a economics dual degree?
Yeah, so in high school, at least, I was actually very humanities focused. So I was like the best, not the best, but a good literature student. And I really like books, and I still love books, fiction especially. So at that age, you really just see courses as humanities and sciences, right? So I knew I wanted to study something technical, just mainly for that real world application thing. But I knew I needed to balance, like have a counterbalance on, the humanities side. And the thing that sparked my interest the most was economics. It pairs well in general. There's good intersection. Game theory is a good example. Mathematical economics is its own whole field, and it's a really nice field. So, yeah.
So you mentioned you like reading. Do you have any specific books that you're currently working on, or a favorite book?
Oh, currently I'm reading The Wind-Up Bird Chronicle by Haruki Murakami. It's a weird one. That author is a weird guy, a bit all over the place, but it kind of helps with the creativity, I find, especially. Yeah.
Okay, I can see that. I mean, a lot of quants have, I'm not going to say like, I guess I'll say it. They're kind of odd hobbies, like different venues. Like I'm not a big reader, but I'm into like, I don't know, other hobbies like beekeeping and like building random side projects.
Pretty cool.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think the most boring quant is the the quant that only does technical work. In a way, their personality becomes overfit to the work, and they start lacking that kind of creative aspect that's especially needed for research, right? So
yeah, I think a lot of it too, when you look at quants, is that when you have such a high standard, a lot of times, like everyone's like trying to be like the very, very best, and it's so competitive. I do think part of like the channel, so my YouTube channel, the podcast, is trying to show like the other interesting pieces of quants.
yeah,
Because even when you watch things, there was a guy on, I think it's called like Backlit Productions. It's a whole YouTube channel on like Wall Street and all that. And there was a guy on there, and he ended up like making millions of dollars, being this hedge fund, and then he retires to be like a fisherman.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think D.E. Shaw himself is in some form of biology, right? Like
Yeah,
he completely jumped ship, right? So, yeah, it's not as linear as people think it should be. So
definitely agree. Okay, so you mentioned you're running a club at Queens here. Do you want to talk about what the club's called, kind of the purpose of the club, just to start off?
yeah, sure. So it's called Quant with two T's, and it stands for the Queen's University Algorithmic Network and Trading Team. And essentially, our general members get hired somewhere around through first semester. We have a 10-week educational program, which fortunately you were able to guest speak at. We are very thankful for that. And it in parallel, teams are building training algorithms that get entered into our paper trading competition, which happens throughout the next semester, and we do a bit of research as well in the next semester. So it's a whole lot of learning, and it's about community building and all that. But we do try to do our things well, especially do essentially our practices correctly, and we try to, for example, verify our curriculum with third-party sources, because we know that this industry specifically is the ratio of information to misinformation is not the nicest. So we definitely make an emphasis on that.
Okay. And your guys' club is super interesting for me because as I was talking to you before about this, you're talking about a lot of these clubs have like financing, like there's whole pools of sponsors that help like support these.
Yeah.
And in the States here, a lot of times we have, I'm gonna put them in air quotes, right? We have clubs, but they're more or less like, I don't know, a bunch of college students get together. We kind of hang out, have free food. The university pays a little bit of money, and yet we don't have other opportunities. Like you've mentioned, you guys go to conferences, for example. Would you mind talking a little bit about the funding piece of it and how you guys raise funds and kind of what are the funds used for?
Yeah, so funds usually come from sponsors, and these are corporate sponsors, right? So when you sit down and think, hey, what's the incentive for the company? It's usually a great recruiting pool and some marketing of some sorts that they see value for a certain subset of the population, right? So for a configuration like that to even be possible, you have to understand that your school itself has to have some form of traction with certain companies. They don't have to be the best companies in the world, right? Canada, we don't have access to your beautiful Citadel and whatnot too easily. But as long as recruiters come on campus and they're mentioning extracurriculars are valuable on the resume for us, that's a great setup. Otherwise, it can be extremely difficult to get sponsors unless you're that one person who has a connection with every single company and is able to get a favor for the first year and it translates to the next years and whatever. But yeah, it's definitely tough this year, especially with COVID, right?
Mm-hmm.
If a company is sponsoring, they most likely have a budget for it. If it's something for a budget for sponsoring schools in general, they do that thing often. If not, and it's a first time thing, there's going to be a little more convincing, a little more like, hey, paperwork, we're not used to this and whatnot. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note too that it's a two-way street, right? It's not like a charity event where companies are just handing out money for the sake of handing out money.
Yeah.
Because as you mentioned before, right, it's somewhat of a filtering process for a lot of these corporations. And I can speak from this from a US perspective of going to like a generic state university and then going to like a super well-known state university. that you have somewhat sort of like a, I don't know, different access where you go to like a no-name school, no one really comes.
Yeah.
But when you go to these big schools, it's always shocking that like they provide food and like mugs and t-shirts and like they're
Sweaters, and
whining
you're
and
gonna leave
dining you
with a
to kind of,
5-star hotel, and but yeah, it's definitely interesting. We could go into that whole like school advantage versus another, and it tends to be more surprising. At least I find it really surprising how non-target schools, the advantage gap is massive, right? And you'd think it'd be less. At least I did.
yeah.
So that's interesting. But yeah, it's definitely a two-way street. You know, you have to understand, you provide that firm value with that filtration process that could potentially save them a ton of money, right? They spend a ton on recruiting. They do tons of things. And if they can have, a subset of individuals that to them is known as valuable, it's very, very helpful. And, that's why kind of having an interview process as an extracurricular is valuable, right? So the fact that we interview our members is extremely valuable because those recruiters know they've gone through a first and second round, even if it's, not at the corporate level, it's maybe, it obviously has its errors. They've done something, and the fact that it's standardized and just, not a boys club of some sort where, he knows him and whatever. And that's how you get into the club. It's more so, strict process. We ask technical questions, which to some people sounds crazy. Like you're asking people technical questions for a club. But yeah, if you don't really treat it with that kind of mentality of standards or some barrier to entry, then.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to realize. So what we're talking about here is when you want to join a club. So say you set up a quantitative finance club at a university, you guys have an interview process. So you don't basically get everybody coming in, which sounds negative on one side, but I think it's important because when I was a part of clubs in university, it's kind of like this open door of people just kind of like coming in and coming out. And we all had a fine. We had to pay, I think it was like, I don't know, $25 or $40 or something to join the club, which was great. It helps, provide food and events. We traveled occasionally, but it was nothing like fancy. But I think having that sort of filter kind of filters out like, okay, these are people that are really serious.
Yeah.
And I think it helps because everybody has like the same goal and you're all pushing towards, education, learning, networking, and moving towards that career. Whereas I guess open clubs are more, I guess, for educational, so people can kind of see what, your industry is. But I think you do miss out on that quality piece of quality education, quality kind of drive between all the members.
Yeah.
And then also from that corporate perspective as well, so people understand this a little bit, right? Corporations only have a limited budget, let's say for like sponsoring schools. So it's important to pick the schools that you would think would have the best return on value. So like, I mean, my undergrad was great, Washington State University. We had a lot of fun. And I'm sure there's some great students there. But at the end of the day, there's not as many students that are geared towards what companies are doing. And so companies end up having to like pick, like, where do you place money? We only have, X amount of dollars. Yeah. And so I think having that filter process is a crucial piece to kind of attract them as well, but seeing how that value translates.
Yeah, definitely. And, if it's in the end, as a leader, you have to kind of understand that your intentions are the best for the collective, right? And if you kind of make it that open format, there's really going to be no attendance on any of the community building. There's going to be so much, this is a side thing. We already get some of that, this is a side thing mentality, right? Even though we have that interview process for providing students all this, all these resources for free, we still get that mentality. And it happens, right? It's a part of it, but the rate of that, inactivity increases so much if you make it an open club. So it's definitely important so that everyone ends up learning, right? In a way that's beneficial to them, or else what is the whole club? It's nothing at that point. It's just you'd be better off studying from a textbook. Yeah. You know what I mean? So yeah.
Yeah. And I think part of it too, one of the advantages of these clubs, so if you're setting up a club, you're listening and you're interested in this, I think one of the pieces too is it's an easy way to get quality speakers. And I think a lot of clubs don't take that risk of stepping out. Like your guys' club just reached out to me and said, hey, Dimitri, we're a club in Canada. We'd like you to come present. I think if more clubs reached out to like people and companies, you'd get a lot back, both on the sponsorship side, but also on the piece of like, I love to talk to clubs, and it's a lot more valuable for me to speak to like 30, 40, 50 students than it is like trying to allocate your time between, 30 or 40 individual students, which is now 30, 40, 50 hours versus doing one presentation, which could be, an hour or 2 hours.
And that's not to say like if you're starting a club, you're not going to get no's. You're going to get tons of no's, like a ridiculous amount of no's, but it definitely helps that you are something that's established. You have a track record of, hey, setting this up. You put the work in to set something up for the speaker. That definitely helps. So yeah, I think speakers are incredibly valuable because these are people who tend to not have too much time on their hands, and they would love to kill multiple birds with one stone in a sense, and at the same time just give back. So definitely an important thing.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about networking here. So we're kind of talking about clubs. We're talking about reaching out to professionals. As a professional, I get a lot of contact with students a lot, and also industry professionals, people that have been in the industry for between 1 and 5 years, and also people that have been in for 20, 25 years. Yeah. So I think one of the key pieces, so again, as a club mentality, is teaching students the soft skills of like interviewing, but also like how do you contact professionals? And I think the majority of people would be shocked when you get like a bad one, because most people understand the basics. And I think the basic format that I like to see is somebody reaches out and says like, A, how do you know me? So most people know me right through like YouTube or LinkedIn or something, and say, hey, I saw your profile, whatever. So kind of like an introduction to how you know me. And then the next piece would be like, I understand you're really busy. So trying to be empathetic with professionals. And then finally asking your question like, what about this information? Or can you do an informational interview? Or can you tell me a little bit about this company, for example? And then thank them for their time at the end. And yet I don't see this structure very often. But I think that's why a lot of people say they reach out and then they never get feedback.
Yeah.
And part of it's the quant side. I mean, I think students don't realize. So I never realized as a student that like I would email someone and think like, oh, it only takes them, a couple minutes to respond.
Why wouldn't they do it? They're happy to help so many kids. I've seen people literally say, people are literally dying to help out young professionals. And, unfortunately, that's not true. People are busy. Like that's the fact of the matter. And you have to have that empathy when you reach out. So
yeah, I think there's also a clustering problem. So when you find people that are really good quality resources, right? Everybody wants their advice. And so it's like they're slammed and they don't have the time. Yeah. And then I also feel like there's a ton of, we'll call industry professionals in general that want to help, but it's like you don't have a track record. You haven't accomplished anything great. So I think a lot of these people are like on that spectrum of like, they all want to help you, but they don't have, no one's asking them.
Yeah.
But I think you also have to judge that as a student contacting people of who do you contact? And that makes a big difference, because if you contact, I don't know, say you reach out to me and you're asking about, I don't know, investment banking, like that's great. But I mean, I don't work in investment banking. I can't give you that personal perspective.
Yeah, definitely. In the end, I think people will contact what they define as valuable. Obviously, they're gonna kind of miscalibrate that judgment and ask you for investment banking or whatnot. But I think like the way I like to think about it is it really boils down to 3 components, and that is, to me, research, empathy, and respect. If you have those 3 things, and it's a very human thing, right? If you just copy and paste that format for sending a message every time, and let's say you get a couple successes, whatever responses, eventually your personality will take over in the conversation. And if you don't have one of those 3 components, it will be evident. So it's a very much, if you want to build your networking, build your personality. And it's very important to admit that no one's personality is perfect. We all have those negative components of us, and everyone's a a work in progress in a sense. But the research is really important so that you, one, don't make that investment banking mistake. For example, you don't completely misgauge the person. Two, you're demonstrating curiosity. Like that is one of the largest things someone on the other side want to see. They don't want to see someone who's gaming the system, getting all these advantages for them, not actually curious about, say, the math or the computer science or whatever it is. So you have to demonstrate that. And that requires you going a couple extra miles and, for example, looking at alternative definitions of the concept or whatever it be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's really important on the research part. The empathy part is you have to understand this person owes you absolutely nothing. Right? This person owes, even you and your YouTube channel, it is charity work, right? By that measure. You owe someone, they don't owe you anything, right? And their time is definitely valuable. That's how you would want to be treated. So keep that in mind. Sometimes you don't need to push and push and push because, it might have effects that you don't know about on the other side, right? Even if they're the most well-off person, you don't know, right? So in the end, that empathy aspect is important. And then respect is just people constantly forget how easy it is to come across arrogant or overconfident in some of your statements. So humans tend to bet too much. For example, they have too high of a confidence rating on certain statements or whatnot, and being humble in the sense that you don't know everything and whatnot, you're genuinely asking to learn, right, is very important. So those individuals who are constantly asking for confirmation bias, like, hey, is this right? Is this right? And then you respond, no, it's not really right. But hey, is this right if this happens, and you keep conditioning and conditioning until you get a check mark, and then yes, it's possible. And the fact is the other side is trying to give you not an outlier, but a statistically significant response for what the situation is. So that's really important.
I think those all are key points and play into exactly how the networking piece works, but also the interviewing component for quants. Right. Because I think the biggest failure, so a big tip here for students, is when you interview, I'm not looking for a genius. And people miss this a lot of times. So they come to the interview and they go through these books or whatever. And like in the interview, you're like trying to show me you're like the smartest person ever. Right. And I'll mention something and then you just start throwing out like catchphrases of like tests and whatnot.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times if you're curious in an interview, like you don't know and you're like, hey, I've never heard of that. Can you expand on that? It might ding you a little bit. Okay, you didn't know some basic topic we're looking for. But at the same time, having that curiosity piece and that excitement.
Yeah.
And the best interviews I've had, so the way I interview is probably different than most. So I hate trading interviews. I think they're the biggest waste of time. They take out these books and make you memorize, probability questions. But when I have an application, I look at the resume and I'll interview you off your resume. So if your resume is like chock full of machine learning and data science material, and that's what we're looking to hire, like I'm going to look at it and I'm going to ask only questions from that. Whereas if you have somebody that comes from like a statistics background or somebody that comes from, I don't know, an econometrics background, for example, I'm going to ask you something very specific to those materials. And I think it's important to have like that base knowledge. So again, as you pointed out, right, do that research, make sure you have the fundamentals down. But at the same time, the best conversations I've had with interviewers is when I'm like deviating. Like I'll be interviewing you and then you mentioned, you've done, I don't know, like neural networks. And I'm like, okay, great. Like, have you ever done LSTM networks? And then they light up and they're super excited. And they're like, oh, I actually have this one project at work. And we'll get off tangent just chatting about like technical topics. And I think it comes back to like being human, like having fun in the conversation, being excited, being curious, also being respectful, and also not trying to be like one up the interviewer.
Yeah, exactly. Like the thing is people can tell when you're just trying to, make money, or just trying to do things for self. Like you will reek of selfishness. It doesn't really happen if you can conceal it that well. You are a special individual, but at the same time, you're gonna let's say you do conceal it that well. You're not going to enjoy your job if you don't have that curious aspect. So you get hired, you're not going to enjoy it. All right. You're just going to get the paycheck, and it's going to be a pretty difficult time when nothing excites you in the morning. So yeah, that's definitely something.
And I'd definitely be weary too of trying to be an expert when people are not.
Yeah.
So I think students miss this a lot. They come in and they'll be all excited. They've got like time series listed on their resume. And so when I interview, right, my whole excitement in life is time series. So like I'm excited to have this good conversation. And then as soon as they start trying to show you like, I know this and I know this, and like they start stating things that are incorrect, and they're trying to kind of like force the issue on how smart they are.
Yeah.
A lot of times I'll just crush you. Because it's like my background is so deep and you don't realize like what you learn in school is great and it covers, I don't know, it's like 2%. And then when you're an industry practitioner for like 10 years, for example, you cover like 10%. But it's like you'll never reach that full spectrum because there's so much to learn. And I think having that piece, like you're talking about, respect and being humble, knowing there's all kinds of stuff you don't know. Like I still see stuff, people will like throw me a paper and say, hey, have you seen this type of model? And I'm like, nope, never seen it. And it applies exactly to my work. So I'm like, we got to look at this. And so having that curiosity piece and being willing to kind of be humble, it's a huge component for the interview and also the networking part.
Yeah, and I think people forget there's a huge cost to rewire an employee's brain.
Oh yeah.
Like you training people on something that they think is so correct or basic can be the largest hassle. So they really hate when people are so overconfident on a concept that they end up being wrong about. So I'm not saying, don't have confidence, but I'm saying, if you're going to say something, don't let the adrenaline take over. Make sure you're saying something you've seen stated, has reputability, like is actually to some extent indisputable by the interviewer. It'll be pretty difficult for you to make it through, in my opinion.
Yeah. And on the confidence piece, this is something I thought was interesting. I interviewed somebody a while back and it was like a team interview. So it's like most interviews are like this now, right? You interview with the first person and then it's like you sit in the room and a second, third, fourth all comes through. They interviewed with a whole list of people and did terrible. Like they missed every single question. They had no background, no personality. Like I'm trying, like as an interviewer, I'm not trying to grill you and figure out why you shouldn't work here. Like I want to figure out why you should work here and trying to find those, I don't know, fun and exciting pieces of you. And they went into a final round with the person that was going to be like the head, the person that was going to make this final decision. And they knew that. And they went on and on about how great the interviews went. And they were just so confident. But it was like they completely misjudged the entire situation. And so I think it's better to come off humble and kind of balance, as you're saying, right? You need some confidence. So it's like you're confident, they know what they're doing. But also they entirely ruined their shot because once the whole discussion was had between everybody, it was obvious that like they were way overconfident on their skills and they didn't have the skills necessary. And then it was kind of like a really big turnoff to see that like you thought you did excellent and you're like an all-star.
Yeah.
And yet you missed every single cue throughout that entire process.
And everyone is obviously guilty of that at some point, right? Especially in your younger years, it's extremely easy. I like to say sophomore students have the highest odds of doing that because you're right off of the comfort from getting through second year, from getting through first year, but you haven't faced too much difficulties. So second year is the perfect spot usually for students to be overconfident in their capabilities. But yeah, I definitely agree. The interesting thing is that it is very difficult to have this mindset that I'm always to some degree wrong. And it actually scares people quite a bit, especially technical people. They're like, okay, wait, if everything has a question mark on it, how do I get through this interview? And really it's like, no, it's okay. Like the whole point is it has a question mark behind it. That's what the scientific method means. So yeah, I would try to avoid overconfidence, and then a step up, try to avoid arrogance, right? So
yeah, definitely. So let's transition a little bit here, but let's start talking about standards in the industry. So I think this is challenging, and I'll give you a kind of an industry practitioner perspective on it, is when you're hiring for different jobs, so it's a huge mistake most students make as well. When you get a resume, you have to realize the biggest strength you have for that application is being a student, right? A lot of students think that somehow, like I've seen resumes and it's terrible. It'll be a resume, and at the very top, it has like, I don't know, like Queen, like your university, like Queen's University on there. It's like a great university, amazing academic background. You're well trained. You're like perfectly fit for the job. And it'll literally be like one line. And then the rest of the resume is things that are not relevant or things that are like internships. And it's great to see experience on there. But when companies are hiring, like they want a good, solid education. Like I'm hiring you for your education. And so we like to see, right, it's obviously great to have on the bottom skills listed. So you need to have like the programming languages you've worked in. I love to see internships as well, right? You've had some real world experience. But that piece that really drives it home is I want like that really good education. I want to make sure you took like the right electives, the right degrees. You have all the fundamental down. And like you mentioned before, like we don't have to retrain you a lot.
Yeah.
And you'll hit the ground running. And so I think these are important aspects as well on the standard side. But I also think the biggest question I get is, Dimitri, what is the quickest, easiest, cheapest route to be a quant? And I think even for me, it's really hard to define quant, right? It's just such a vague term these days. And then also, how do you put some sort of, I don't know, some sort of level there? Because different jobs require different skills. So if you're going to go into the hedge fund route versus the banking route, or you go into like implementation versus trading versus, you know, quantitative research, everything's going to have some sort of standard. Yeah. But it's hard to explain to people. There's definitely a bare minimum of like the correct degrees, the correct training, the correct education, at least to be able to kind of crack into one of these positions based on your strengths.
Yeah. So, you know, one point where I would somewhat disagree with you is that this is very firm dependent. Some firms have the complete mindset, and they might be like amazing firms. I'm not saying they're, you know, these decisions make them better or worse, but some firms have the perspective that, you know, school is typically BS, for example, right? And that experience is everything. Or that, you know, the technical assessments we give in the interview are the best assessment, right? And that's usually going to be the case, is that they place a large amount of weight on the interview assessments, right? Because they've designed that, they define what's important. They have more confidence in themselves, right? Which is fair. It's their role. But it for definitely for some firms, you know, that education piece is a big thing, and it's why the target versus non-target school gap can be massive. So I think on the topic of standards as a whole, you know, people sometimes get upset when a company is like, "Hey, we only do grad students," or, for example, an extracurricular like ours doesn't hire a certain student or whatnot. I think people forget that barriers to entry are what make the industry competitive and therefore, you know, as elite as it is. Without that, you know, if it was anyone's game, you know, if the whole capitalism aspect was gone, it would be like much harder. And you have to realize it's somewhat for the best of your own interests as someone who's seeking employment. If you're not told no a good couple of times, how are you going to refine your craft? You know, how are you going to get back there and actually, you know, get the interview beat the interview the next time? So standards are definitely important, and I think the difficulty comes in what's the best standard to define, right? And I think, you know, as well, even with your interview process, that education piece is not a perfect standard.
No.
It is by no means.
Definitely not.
Outliers definitely exist, right? There's definitely that one out of probably 100,000 rock star undergrad who maybe is at the level of some grad students. But this comes back to, hey, we're looking at statistically significant versus the outliers. how can I make a judgment off of the outliers if I'm scaling this, especially, right? These people aren't conducting interviews on like one or two people. They're doing batches of batches. They have to, um, you know, do a ton of people, and they are not saying their interview process is perfect. Every interview process is imperfect. That's just
Yeah.
that's unfortunately a consequence of the way it works. But yeah, I think standards are definitely important, and it can be tough and heartbreaking to applicants at times when they feel the standards are wrong or they misjudged or whatever. But they're necessary. If you don't draw the line, what happens?
Right. And I think you kind of hit part of this on the head here, which is what's like, I think the biggest question I have for a lot of people that message me, because I have so many questions on careers and all that, is like, why are you doing this? Like, what's the goal behind it? And I think there's two camps kind of to it here. There's people that want to be a quant. They just throw this label on it of I'm a quant, which is such a vague term in general, but they want it for the money piece.
Yeah.
And I think that's super misleading because they think somehow like, okay, if you give me the title, so Dimitri, I don't know, knights you a quant all of a sudden, that you're going to make like $100,000 right out of school, or you're going to make $500,000 right out of school. And I think there's also that two-edged piece. So you have the people going after the money, but you're never going to do well in the industry because you don't just love what you do. And there's people like me that are reading textbooks on the weekend. I mean, I've got a few sitting here I've been working on. And so it's like you're so involved in it. And then the other piece of the standard is also like you mentioned, right? What's the accomplishment?
Yeah.
Like for me, I want to set the bar as high as possible and continually work for that even after the years, because it's great to look back and go, wow, I accomplished an amazing undergrad at this university. And then I went all along and I went to this graduate school and I accomplished, this top degree from this top school. And then, you're trying to notch these things. Like you want to have some sort of standard just because it makes you feel accomplished as well. If there's no standard there, it's like everybody jumps into the party. It's like you start losing value and meaning in the sense of like, what are you accomplishing, right? If you have a guy that's got, and I've seen a guy that has actually 2 PhDs and like 3 masters, which I think is like way overkill, right?
Can I talk to this individual? I'm joking.
But he's really smart. The guy's brilliant. And I've talked to him and he's super happy. And the thing that makes him so well-rounded as a quant isn't necessarily the education piece. It's to him that he set his own internal standard and it's so high that you can tell he's super excited. He's
loving it when he's studying, right? He's loving, literally, it's his thing at that point. It's not really even work. So yeah, and it varies. Like certain people get completely stressed out by standards to the point where they don't have too many internal standards. They go through life as it is, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's very important for you to hold yourself accountable, especially if you're approaching like the quant industry. Like the worst thing to do is not hold yourself accountable. But it's also very important. Don't be too hard on yourself and whatnot. But yeah,
I think it's important too, because I think it's hard, especially when you're like right at the beginning, because you think like you have to hurry and get all these skills and like get all the information put together and then hurry and jump into the industry as well. But I think a lot of times it's more important to set like a long-term goal of like, this is what I define, this is what my goal is. But then also start just like, okay, that's the goal. Like I'm going to, take my goal here and set it like way off to the side. And then have fun doing the learning process. Like you don't need to label yourself as a specific thing, but just have fun with it. Go online, find fun tutorials to kind of work through, join these clubs like you guys have, start getting more of an industry perspective, get some more training and education, and just have fun building that whole process up.
Yeah, exactly.
Eventually you'll end up in the industry.
Yeah, so this kind of like goes to something that I find really important is like, in statistics, the law of large numbers applies to a lot of things in life, right? You will converge to your value as an individual. It will happen given enough time. God forbid you have an early death or anything, but given enough time, you will converge, right? And at the same time, if you're only interested in money, you will converge to coming across as that. And you may lose everything you have, even though you were able to conceal your true intentions for a couple of minutes. I actually had this, I remember in second year, someone like someone was talking to me about interviews or whatnot, and they weren't the most academically rigorous students, and I would tell them like you cannot cheat an interview process. Like get out of that mindset right now. And he looked at me in the most disgusted face, like with the most disgusted face, like, no, that's BS. I'm going to do it. And to this day, like he has not done anything, right? So that's obviously one case, but there are billions of cases of just like, given enough time, you'll get where you're supposed to be. And it's an important thing to remember, because even though you might want to work only on the outcome related thing and put all your efforts towards the outcome, the process is what ends up actually allowing you to get the outcome. So it's kind of like you have to fight that urge to right now do the things that seem more important, and more so build, refine the craft. If you're studying, are you even studying properly? Can you notice something with your thinking pattern that actually affects your interviews somehow? Like people completely forget that, right? It's all about this building. Like humans have all this stuff going on. Like it's by no means like that simple. So you kind of have to do a lot of use a lot of headspace on just checking if the basics are correct, and then you can start with the more outcome related stuff.
Yeah. And a piece for that too, I think, for the standards component, is in the industry, you'll find out the vast majority of mistakes, issues, career-wise, technical-wise, it always comes down to the fundamentals.
Yeah.
And so students, I think a lot of times they'll get, book reviews from me are like, they're fun to do because I love reading the books and getting a free book and reading it. Yeah. But at the same time, it's a nightmare because I'll review a book, like this book is excellent. It's like the best book on econometrics, for example, and probability theory and statistics. And I'll lay it all out. And then people are like, Dimitri, that is too simple of a book. I need they'll start throwing these advanced books. But it's like your mistakes, when you get to the industry, I'm going to guarantee you, all of your mistakes, looks like 90% of them at least, are going to be fundamental. Incorrect data sampling, incorrect testing. It's never like you didn't select the super crazy complex model methodology. And if you would have done all this craziness, you would have been great. I think having those fundamentals is definitely a piece where it's like students need to enjoy the process, go back and review it.
So the thing is, though, what you just said is old-fashioned, right? Mm-hmm. People will look at that and say, especially students, they won't get the dopamine rush. They won't get their hey. And this is an issue. When people forget, when they prioritize novelty so much, they don't actually check the prerequisites of what they need. So, for example, machine learning is so hot, right? And people will go through this interview, and for some quantitative team of some sorts, they'll go through that interview. They'll be talking about the newest things in machine learning. Hey, this and that. Meanwhile, you can't even write a single proof of any of this underlying math. And then by the end of the interview, you're pissed off, like, man, these guys are all old-fashioned. Like these guys are worried about the stuff that doesn't make you money. This is the new stuff. This makes you money. But when you start debugging that new thing in production or working with it, the things that get you are the things that are your reflexes, right? So if you haven't drilled down a specific proof or statistics question that's important to machine learning, and when you look at it, you can do it in a matter of seconds. It is a reflex, right? If that is what you need, that is literally what you need. You don't need all this new stuff. You need the reflex to be correct and refined. And it's going to take you to look at the basics and review it. Even after you've done a course in probability, you're going to have to come back to it, look at your notes, do those questions, and you'll be shocked that you can't do half of them.
Yeah. And the thing that baffles me too is that when you have, this is the biggest thing. When people talk about they want to see machine learning for finance, so everyone's looking for the textbook or something. Yeah. I'm always confused. I'm I don't get it. Why do you need a textbook for that? And people are like, what do you mean? We need this expert guide and all this information. If you know the basics of machine learning and statistics, You can
Bottom
apply
up.
that to any
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
And like, as you mentioned too, the basics, when I interview, if you list out, for example, neural nets, which is like a fun side interest of mine, when you list it out, I'm going to make you go through, how do you do forward propagation?
Yeah.
And I'll make you do it on paper. And I had somebody with a PhD in a very high-end field of mathematics, top-rated school, and they couldn't do it.
Yeah, like, can you write SGD by hand?
Yeah.
You know?
I'll like push you and feed you. So I'm like, okay, we're going to use a logistic activation function.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm like trying to do it, like, do you even know the logistic function? Can you write it down? There's just nothing. And it's going back that, I want the basics, because if you understand all the basics, then when we go to some complex application or some new theory, it's so fast. The whole team is already clicking. We're already all at the same page. And then we're like working on the fringes of the new problem. Where a lot of these young kids, it's like, you've seen these problems, but then I have to re-go back to say, like, your idea that you're proposing sucks. And I'm explaining why. And it's like they missed all these fundamental pieces on how it's not feasible to implement, or you can't actually calculate it, for example, and trying to go through that. So definitely those core fundamental basics will take you a lot further than the fun, exciting, cutting edge papers and whatnot.
Yeah, definitely. And just a disclaimer on that end is like, I don't think we're knocking machine learning, right? It's
no.
beautiful field with great success. Sure, it doesn't have the track record in finance that it has in other industries, but I think we're really talking about is how the community gets saturated and how the mind is very novelty only, which really doesn't make sense. You're in a sense kind of like forcing it. You're forcing something just because it's new. In the end, can you even get a simpler thing right? Like done right. And I think the thing is the way the media and stuff does everything, it shows like how you can go from point A to point C, but hides the point B in the middle. And so now people are thinking this is the era where gaps are okay, where you can make massive leaps to something. And yes, there's actually some truth to that. Like, I think we are in a era where decisions are more leveraged than ever, right? And for a variety of reasons. But at the same time, having that middle component prerequisite, like the law of large numbers will take effect, and your gaps will be very evident, and they can completely destroy you. So something to be aware of, definitely.
Yeah. Okay, so to wrap up this podcast here, do you have any advice for students who are currently working on their undergrads, degrees, looking for jobs, anything along those lines?
Oh man, I'm by no means an expert in this, and I'm by no means an expert, but I would just say, like, on a personal note, like, make sure you're enjoying what you're doing, and definitely don't be afraid to put in the hours. Don't have like imposter syndrome, and think constantly relative to other students, because that's usually what gets people going. Is they create these massive group networks, and they say, hey, one's better than another. They see that one's like further off than another, and they get worried. But in the end, like, your life is your life. Do what you want to do, and just enjoy it and work hard towards it. That's what I would suggest more than anything.
All right, Ali, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me.